When my daughter Aaliyah Fisher forced me to sleep in her garage during what was supposed to be a heartwarming family reunion, I never imagined it would lead to the most shocking revelation of our lives. After 20 years of being treated like an unwelcome burden, dismissed as the embarrassing mother who didn't fit into her upscale lifestyle, I had finally reached my breaking point. But Aaliyah had no idea that the luxurious Oakwood Hills property she was so proud of, the gleaming mansion she used to showcase her success, the very land beneath her feet that gave her such confidence to look down on me, all of it belonged to me. For decades, I had kept this secret, watching her build her perfect life on ground I owned, hoping that one day she might welcome me back as her mother rather than treat me like hired help. That garage night changed everything, because sometimes the person you're stepping on holds the foundation of your entire world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Stella Wright, and I'm 72 years old. Most people in the small town of Millbrook know me as the quiet widow who works part-time at Henderson's General Store and tends to her vegetable garden behind the modest rental apartment on Elm Street. What they don't know is that I own some of the most valuable real estate in the Tri-County area, including a sprawling 15-acre plot in the exclusive Oakwood Hills development where million-dollar homes sit like crowns on perfectly manicured lawns. I never intended to keep this secret for so long. When my late husband George Holmes and I purchased that land back in 1987 for what seemed like an astronomical sum at the time, $35,000, it was nothing more than rolling farmland dotted with oak trees and bordered by a meandering creek. George had big dreams for that property. He envisioned building our dream home there, maybe even subdividing part of it to help fund our retirement. "Stella," he'd say, walking me through the tall grass on summer evenings, "this is going to be our legacy, something we can pass down to Aaliyah and her future family." But life, as it often does, had different plans. George passed away suddenly from a heart attack in 1995, just 2 years after Aaliyah graduated from college and moved to the city. In my grief, I couldn't bear the thought of building anything on that land. It felt too much like trying to fulfill George's dreams without him there to share them. So I let it sit, paying the modest property taxes each year from my small savings, watching the grass grow tall and the seasons change while I focused on just getting through each day without my husband. During those early years of widowhood, Aaliyah would visit occasionally, though even then I could sense her growing discomfort with Millbrook's small-town pace and my simple lifestyle. She had studied business at the State University and married Jacob Hayes, an ambitious real estate developer she'd met during her senior year. Jacob was handsome, charming, and possessed the kind of confidence that comes from growing up in an upper-middle-class family where success was expected rather than hoped for. At first, I tried to connect with Jacob to welcome him into our small family, but it became clear very quickly that he saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a relationship to nurture. During those early visits, I'd catch him whispering to Aaliyah about upgrading various aspects of their life together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my presence was one of the things he felt needed upgrading. The transformation in Aaliyah was gradual but unmistakable. The warm, curious young woman who used to spend hours helping me in the garden and listening to stories about her father slowly morphed into someone who checked her phone constantly during our conversations and made subtle comments about how I might benefit from modernizing my appearance or living situation. When she did visit, it felt more like charity than love, as if she was fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying time with her mother. By 2010, Aaliyah and Jacob had made enough money in real estate development to start looking for their own dream property. I'll never forget the phone call when she told me they'd found the perfect spot in something called Oakwood Hills. My heart nearly stopped when she described the location: rolling hills, mature oak trees, a creek running through the back of the property. I knew immediately she was talking about my land, the same 15 acres George and I had walked hand in hand decades earlier. What I discovered was that in the intervening years, a developer named Calvin Morrison had approached the county about purchasing development rights to the area. He'd created beautiful marketing materials, hired landscape architects, and begun selling lots to wealthy buyers who wanted to build custom homes in a prestigious gated community. There was just one problem. He didn't actually own all the land he was selling. Specifically, he didn't own my 15 acres, which happened to be some of the most desirable lots in the entire development. Through a series of legal oversights and what can only be described as wishful thinking, Morrison had assumed he could eventually acquire my property through eminent domain, or that I, as an elderly widow, would be easy to convince to sell for below market value. He was wrong on both counts. When his lawyers finally contacted me about selling, they offered me $50,000 for land that was now worth well over $2 million, given its location within the Oakwood Hills development. I said, "No, of course." But I didn't tell them why I was refusing, and I certainly didn't tell them that my own daughter was one of the buyers who had already put down a deposit on one of their lots. Instead, I hired my own attorney, a sharp young woman named Patricia Wells who specialized in real estate law, and we quietly began documenting exactly what was happening. What we discovered was that Morrison had sold the same lots to multiple buyers, using carefully worded contracts that promised development rights and future ownership, without actually guaranteeing clear title to the land. Aaliyah and Jacob, along with 5 other couples, had essentially purchased the right to build homes on land that Morrison didn't own and couldn't legally sell. The ethical thing to do would have been to contact Aaliyah immediately and explain the situation. But by this point, our relationship had deteriorated so much that I wasn't even sure she'd believe me. Our phone calls had become brief and formal. Her visits had dwindled to major holidays only. And when she did come to Millbrook, she spent most of her time sighing about how quaint and outdated everything was. So I made a decision that I've questioned countless times over the years. I decided to let events unfold naturally while protecting my legal interests. Through Patricia, I entered into a unique arrangement with Morrison's company. Rather than stopping the development entirely, which would have financially ruined several families who had invested their life savings in their Oakwood Hills homes, I agreed to lease the land to the development company for 99 years, at a rate of $1 per year. The catch was that I retained ultimate ownership and could reclaim the property with 60 days' notice if certain conditions weren't met. The primary condition was that all current residents had to be in good standing with their mortgage payments and property maintenance. But buried deep in the legal paperwork was another clause that Patricia had insisted on including. I could reclaim any individual lot if I had been personally mistreated or discriminated against by the residents of that lot. At the time, it seemed like a harmless addition. I never imagined I'd need to use it, especially not against my own daughter. I thought maybe, just maybe, if Aaliyah was finally able to build her dream home and achieve the lifestyle she'd always wanted, she might find her way back to appreciating the simpler things in life, including her relationship with me. Aaliyah and Jacob broke ground on their custom home in 2011, and it was everything they'd dreamed of and more. A sprawling 6,000 square foot colonial with soaring ceilings, marble countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the rolling hills and mature oak trees that had originally drawn George and me to the property. They spared no expense, hiring the best contractors and designers, creating a showcase home that was featured in the local lifestyle magazine as Oakwood Hills' crown jewel. For the next decade, I watched from afar as my daughter built her perfect life on my land. She had 2 beautiful sons, Alexander and Benjamin, who I saw maybe 3 times a year if I was lucky. She joined the country club, served on the board of the local arts council, and hosted elaborate parties that were the talk of Oakwood Hills' social scene. And through it all, I remained her secret, the embarrassing mother from Millbrook who didn't fit into her carefully curated world. When forced to acknowledge my existence at family gatherings, She'd introduce me as Stella rather than my mother, and she'd quickly change the subject if anyone asked about my background or where I lived. But I held on to hope that things would change. I kept the secret of my land ownership, thinking that perhaps when the boys got older, or when Aaliyah felt more secure in her social position, she might remember the woman who had raised her with love and sacrifice. I thought maybe she just needed time to realize that success without family connections felt hollow. I was wrong about that too. The bigger her house got, the smaller her heart seemed to become. And now, as I prepared for what would become the most humiliating visit of my life, I had no idea that my years of patience and hope were about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes, the only way to teach someone about respect is to remind them exactly who holds the power they've taken for granted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, delivered through a text message that was as cold and formal as a business memo. Mother, Jacob's firm is hosting an important client dinner this Saturday at our home. We need someone to help with the grandkids during the event. Can you come Friday and stay through Sunday? Please let me know by tomorrow. No. How are you? No. We'd love to see you. Just a request for free babysitting services disguised as a family invitation. But after 3 years of virtually no contact, beyond obligatory holiday phone calls, I was desperate enough for any connection with my grandsons that I immediately texted back, "Of course, sweetheart. What time should I arrive Friday?" Her response came 2 hours later. "Anytime after 3 p.m. works. The boys will be excited to see you." I spent the rest of the week preparing for the visit with an enthusiasm that now embarrasses me to remember. I bought new clothes. Nothing fancy, just a few comfortable outfits that I hoped would help me blend into Aaliyah's sophisticated world without standing out as the dowdy mother from Millbrook. I purchased gifts for Alexander and Benjamin, educational games I thought they might enjoy, and books about adventure and discovery that reminded me of the stories Aaliyah had loved at their age. Most importantly, I convinced myself that this invitation represented a turning point in our relationship. Maybe Aaliyah had finally realized that family connections mattered more than social status. Maybe she wanted her sons to have a real relationship with their grandmother. Maybe, after all these years, she was ready to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I should have known better. The drive to Oakwood Hills on that Friday afternoon felt like traveling to a foreign country. The moment I passed through the ornate iron gates with their brass nameplate, I was reminded of just how different our worlds had become. The security guard checked my name against a list. Apparently, Aaliyah had to pre-approve even her own mother's visit, and gave me a temporary pass with my photo and the words, "Visitor, expires Sunday," printed in bold red letters. As I drove, through the winding streets lined with massive homes, each more impressive than the last, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. These weren't just houses. They were statements of wealth and success that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched like green carpets, interrupted only by elaborate landscaping featuring exotic plants that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Aaliyah's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its Georgian colonial facade rising majestically against a backdrop of the oak trees that George and I had once walked beneath. The circular driveway could easily accommodate a dozen cars, and the front entrance featured massive columns that made the home look more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. I parked my 15-year-old Honda Civic next to Jacob's gleaming BMW, feeling immediately self-conscious about the contrast. As I gathered my overnight bag and the gifts for the boys, I noticed a woman across the street watching me from her perfectly appointed front porch. She seemed to be taking inventory of my appearance, my car, my obvious status as someone who didn't quite belong in this neighborhood. Aaliyah answered the door wearing an outfit that probably cost more than I made in a month. a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored pants that screamed expensive good taste. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her smile was the kind of practiced expression that probably worked wonders at charity galas, but felt cold and artificial directed at her own mother. "Mother," she said, stepping aside, to let me enter the marble-floored foyer. "You made good time. I was just getting ready to brief you on the weekend schedule." Brief me? As if I were hired help rather than her mother coming for a family visit. "It's wonderful to see you, Aaliyah," I said, setting down my bag and moving toward her for a hug. The embrace was perfunctory, a quick pat on the back before she stepped away, already checking her phone for messages that were apparently more important than our reunion. "The boys are at soccer practice with Jacob," she continued, scrolling through her screen. "They won't be back until 6. That gives us time to go over the house rules and get you settled." House rules for a weekend visit with my own family. She led me through rooms that belonged in a design magazine. Soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on. Everything was pristine, coordinated, and completely devoid of the comfortable chaos that I associated with homes where families actually lived. There were no toys scattered around, no family photos on side tables, no signs that two active boys called this place home. "The guest room is being renovated," Aaliyah explained as we walked through the kitchen with its restaurant-quality appliances and marble countertops. "We're having new hardwood floors installed and the walls repainted. The contractors made more of a mess than expected, so it's not really habitable right now." My heart sank as I began to suspect where this conversation was heading. "So where will I be staying?" I asked, though I was beginning to fear I already knew the answer. Aaliyah paused, at a door that led to what I assumed was a utility room. "Well, the master guest suite won't be ready until next month, and Alexander and Benjamin's rooms are too small for an additional bed. But don't worry, we've made arrangements that should work perfectly for the weekend." She opened the door to reveal the 3-car garage, complete with Jacob's BMW, her Mercedes SUV, and a vintage Porsche that I assumed was Jacob's weekend toy. But my attention was immediately drawn to the corner where someone had set up what could generously be called a makeshift bedroom. A narrow cot with a thin mattress, a single pillow, and a blanket that looked like it had been pulled from a linen closet. "You want me to sleep in the garage?" I asked, unable to hide the shock in my voice. "It's really quite comfortable," Aaliyah said quickly, her tone taking on the overly bright quality of someone trying to sell a bad idea. "We've got a space heater for warmth, and there's a bathroom right through that door that connects to the pool house. The boys sometimes camp out here during sleepovers. They think it's an adventure." I stared at the cot, trying to process what was happening. My daughter, who lived in a 6,000-square-foot mansion built on land that I owned, was asking me to sleep in her garage like unwanted storage. "Aaliyah," I said slowly, "surely there's somewhere else I could stay. What about the living room, sofa, or even an air mattress in one of the other rooms?" Her expression tightened slightly, the practiced smile slipping just enough to reveal her irritation. "Mother, tomorrow night is extremely important for Jacob's career. We're hosting the senior partners from his firm and their wives, along with several major clients. Everything has to be perfect. The house has to look absolutely flawless, and we can't have unexpected complications." The implication was clear. I was an unexpected complication. "I understand that tomorrow is important," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But I'm your mother, Aaliyah. Surely you can find a place for me to sleep that doesn't involve a garage." "It's just for 2 nights," she said, her tone becoming more defensive. "And honestly, Mother, it's not that different from camping. You used to take me camping when I was little, remember? You said it built character." The comparison was so absurd, so deliberately hurtful, that I felt tears prick at my eyes. Taking your 7-year-old daughter on a fun camping adventure was nothing. Like relegating your elderly mother to a garage because she might embarrass you in front of your important friends. This is different, Aaliyah, and you know it." She sighed, the kind of exaggerated sound that suggested I was being unreasonable and dramatic. "Look, Mother, if you're not comfortable with the arrangements, I can call you a hotel room at the Hampton Inn near the highway. It's only about 20 minutes away, and you could drive over to spend time with the boys during the day." The offer was clearly meant to make me feel like the garage was actually the better option. Stay in a budget hotel 20 minutes away and feel like an outsider visiting my own family, or accept the humiliation of sleeping next to their luxury cars and pretend it was perfectly normal. I looked around the garage, taking in the pristine concrete floors, the organized tool bench, the golf clubs and exercise equipment neatly arranged along the walls. This was where they stored their possessions, their recreational equipment, their seasonal decorations. And now, apparently, their inconvenient relatives. "The boys really are excited to see you," Aaliyah added, softening her tone slightly. "Alexander has been asking about his grandmother, and Benjamin has a new magic trick he wants to show you. It would mean a lot to them if you stayed. And there it was, the emotional manipulation disguised as family sentiment. She knew exactly which buttons to push, knew that my love for my grandsons would override my sense of dignity and self-respect. She was counting on my desperation for family connection to make me accept treatment that I would never tolerate from anyone else. I set my overnight bag down next to the cot and forced a smile. "Of course I'll stay. I'm here for the boys." Aaliyah's relief was visible. "Wonderful. Now, let me go over the schedule for tomorrow so you know exactly when you'll need to keep the boys occupied and when you should stay out of sight. Stay out of sight." As if I were a shameful secret rather than the woman who had raised her, sacrificed for her, and loved her unconditionally for 38 years. As she outlined the detailed timeline for Saturday's event, when the caterers would arrive, when I should take the boys to the park to get them out of the way, when I should make sure to remain invisible so as not to disrupt the carefully orchestrated perfection of her dinner party, I found myself looking around the garage with new eyes. This space, where my daughter expected me to sleep like unwanted luggage, sat on the land that my late husband and I had dreamed of passing down to our family. The concrete foundation beneath my feet rested on soil that George and I had once walked together, making plans for our future and hers. The beautiful view of oak trees that she boasted about to her friends was the same landscape that had captured our hearts all those years ago. She had no idea that every square inch of her perfect property, every blade of grass in her manicured lawn, every tree that provided privacy from her neighbors belonged to me. She had built her entire identity around this address, this status symbol, this tangible proof of her success and superiority. And she was making me sleep in the garage of a house built on my own land. The irony was so profound, so darkly poetic, that I almost laughed. Almost. But the humiliation was too fresh, the pain too sharp, for laughter. Instead, I smiled and nodded and promised to follow her rules, all while a plan began forming in the back of my mind. Sometimes the best lessons are taught not with words, but with reality. And reality, I was about to discover, had a way of humbling even the most arrogant. That first night in the garage, lying on the narrow cot while listening to the automatic sprinkler system water the lawn that was technically mine, I found myself thinking about how we had arrived at this point. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, steady erosion of the mother-daughter bond that had once been the most important relationship in both our lives. Aaliyah had been such a bright, curious little girl. After George died when she was only 15, we had clung to each other through the grief, two people trying to navigate a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. I worked double shifts at Henderson's General Store and took on weekend cleaning jobs to make sure she could participate in school activities, have nice clothes, and never feel like the poor kid whose father had died too young. I remember the night she came home from her high school guidance counselor's office with pamphlets for colleges I'd never heard of. "Mom," she'd said, spreading the glossy brochures across our small kitchen table, "Mrs. Patterson thinks I could get into the state university, maybe even get a scholarship." I had been so proud of her academic achievements, so excited about the possibilities that education could open for her. George had always said that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take away from you, and watching Aaliyah excel in her studies felt like honoring his memory. What I hadn't anticipated was how the college experience would change her fundamental perspective on life, family, and success. During her freshman year, Aaliyah called me almost every day. She'd tell me about her classes, her professors, the new friends she was making. But gradually, I began to notice subtle changes in the way she spoke about our life in Millbrook. What used to be warm memories became quaint stories. What used to be proud descriptions of how we'd overcome adversity became embarrassing. Admissions of our modest circumstances. "Mom," she said during one call in her sophomore year, "my roommate's parents are taking us all out to dinner at this really nice restaurant next weekend. What should I wear? I don't want to look like I don't belong." That phrase, "I don't want to look like I don't belong," became increasingly common in our conversations. She was surrounded by students from wealthy families, kids who talked casually about summer homes and European vacations and trust funds. For the first time in her life, Aaliyah was acutely aware of what she didn't have, and instead of appreciating what she did have, she became ashamed of her background. The summer after her sophomore year, she came home with a new wardrobe, a new way of speaking, and a new set of expectations about how her life should look. She complained about the size of our apartment, the lack of air conditioning, the fact that we didn't have cable television or high-speed internet. When her college friends called, she'd take the phone into her bedroom and speak in whispers, as if she were afraid they might somehow sense the modesty of her surroundings through the telephone line. It was during her junior year that she met Jacob Hayes. He was a year ahead of her, studying business with a focus on real estate development. His father owned a successful construction company, and Jacob talked confidently about his plans to expand the family business into luxury residential developments. He was handsome, ambitious, and came from the kind of family that Aaliyah had been observing and envying for 3 years. When she brought him home for Thanksgiving that year, I tried my best to make a good impression. I prepared all of Aaliyah's favorite dishes, cleaned the apartment until it sparkled, and even bought a new tablecloth for our small dining table. But I could see Jacob taking inventory of our modest surroundings, his eyes lingering on our second-hand furniture and the faded wallpaper I couldn't afford to replace. "Mrs. Wright," he said politely when I asked about his family's business, "we focus primarily on high-end residential developments, properties for discerning buyers who appreciate quality craftsmanship and exclusive locations." The way he emphasized discerning and exclusive made it clear that our little apartment in Millbrook fell far short of his standards. But what hurt more was watching Aaliyah hang on his every word, clearly impressed by his confidence and his family's success. That was the beginning of the end of our close relationship, though I didn't recognize it at the time. After graduation, Aaliyah and Jacob moved to Westfield, a mid-sized city about 2 hours away from Millbrook. Jacob had secured a position with a commercial real estate firm, and Aaliyah found work as a marketing coordinator for a luxury car dealership. They rented a sleek downtown apartment and began building the kind of sophisticated urban lifestyle that Aaliyah had dreamed about during her college years. My visits to their new home became increasingly awkward. Everything was expensive, modern, and chosen for its aesthetic appeal rather than its comfort or practicality. I felt like I was visiting a showroom rather than a home where my daughter lived. Aaliyah would give me tours as if I were a tourist, pointing out designer furniture and expensive artwork while I nodded and smiled and tried to hide my discomfort with this new version of her life. "We're saving up for a down payment on a house," she told me during one visit. "Jacob has his eye on some developing areas where property values are expected to increase significantly. We want to get in early, build equity, maybe even flip the house in a few years for a profit. Real estate had become Jacob's obsession, and by extension, Aaliyah's as well. They talked constantly about property values, market trends, and investment opportunities. Every conversation seemed to revolve around money, how to make more of it, how to spend it wisely, how to accumulate the kind of wealth that would give them access to the exclusive lifestyle they coveted. Their wedding in 2009 was a lavish affair that Jacob's parents largely financed. Held at a country club I couldn't afford to join, attended by people whose idea of casual conversation involved discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes, it was a day that should have been about love and family, but felt more like a business, networking event. I remember standing alone during the reception, watching Aaliyah laugh and mingle with Jacob's family and friends, and realizing that I had become a stranger at my own daughter's wedding. When people asked about my background, Aaliyah would quickly change the subject or introduce me to someone else, as if my presence were an obligation she needed to manage, rather than a joy she wanted to share. The birth of Alexander in 2012 brought me hope that maybe grandmotherhood would help us reconnect. But even that joyful occasion was complicated by Aaliyah's new standards and expectations. When I offered to help with the baby, she politely declined, explaining that they had hired a professional nanny and that my old-fashioned approach to care might not align with the latest pediatric recommendations. When I brought hand-knitted blankets and homemade baby food, she thanked me graciously, but I later saw the items tucked away in a closet, apparently deemed unsuitable for her perfectly appointed nursery. Benjamin's birth, 2 years later, followed the same pattern. I was invited to the hospital after the delivery, allowed to hold my grandson for a few minutes, and then gently dismissed so that the real caregivers could take over. The boys grew up knowing me as the grandmother who visited occasionally, brought gifts that their parents usually replaced with more expensive versions, and lived in a place called Millbrook that their mother described as where she grew up before. She knew better. By the time they moved to Oakwood Hills in 2015, our relationship had deteriorated to the point where my visits were scheduled like business appointments. Aaliyah would call a few weeks in advance, suggest a date that worked with their social calendar, and outline exactly what activities were appropriate and which areas of their lives I should avoid discussing. I became a carefully managed element of their family story, acknowledged when necessary, but never allowed to be fully present or authentically involved. What Aaliyah didn't know, as she orchestrated these controlled visits and managed my access to my own grandsons, was that I had been quietly watching her build her perfect life on property that belonged to me. Every time she bragged about their prestigious address, every time she mentioned the property values in Oakwood Hills, every time she used their home as a symbol of their success and sophistication, she was unknowingly crediting me with providing the foundation for everything she was so proud of. The irony was so profound, it sometimes kept me awake at night. My daughter had spent years distancing herself from me because she was ashamed of my modest lifestyle and humble background. She had gradually erased me from her narrative, turning me into an embarrassing footnote in the story of her rise to social prominence. But the land beneath her feet, the address that gave her such confidence, the property that served as the foundation for her entire identity, all of it was mine. She had built her sense of superiority on ground that I owned, funded by money that George and I had saved through the kind of modest, careful living that she now found so embarrassing. As I lay in that garage, listening to the hum of expensive appliances and the whisper of climate-controlled air that kept her luxury cars comfortable, I wondered what would happen if she ever learned the truth. Would it humble her? Would it make her realize how wrong she had been about the value of family versus the value of material success? Or would she simply find a way to rationalize it, to maintain her sense of superiority even in the face of such overwhelming irony? Was about to find out. The next morning began with the sound of Jacob's BMW starting up at precisely 6:30 a.m., the engine noise echoing through the garage where I had spent a mostly sleepless night on the narrow cot. The concrete floor had been cold despite the small space heater, and every time one of their luxury cars' security systems chirped or the automatic garage door opener cycled through its maintenance routine, I was jolted awake. I lay there for a few minutes after Jacob left, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that yesterday had been some kind of surreal nightmare. But the ache in my back from the thin mattress and the smell of motor oil and cleaning supplies confirmed that I had indeed spent the night in my daughter's garage, treated like unwanted storage rather than a beloved family member. Around 7:30, I heard footsteps on the other side of the door that connected the garage to the main house. Aaliyah appeared, already dressed in yoga attire that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, carrying a travel mug of what smelled like expensive coffee. "Good morning, Mother," she said briskly, checking her smartwatch. "I hope you slept well. I'm heading to my Pilates class, but the boys should be up soon. There's cereal in the pantry for breakfast, and I've left a list of approved snacks on the kitchen counter." Approved snacks, as if I might poison my own grandsons with inappropriate food choices. "What time will you be back?" I asked, sitting up on the cot and trying to work out the kinks in my neck. "Not until around 10. Then I have a conference call with the florist about tomorrow night's arrangements, followed by a meeting with the caterer. The house needs to be absolutely perfect for Jacob's dinner party." She paused, giving me a pointed look. "I'm trusting you to keep the boys occupied and out of the way while I handle these preparations." The implication was clear. My job was to be invisible while she focused on the important business of impressing Jacob's colleagues and clients. After she left, I made my way into the house through the connecting door, feeling like an intruder in what should have been a family home. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, gleaming granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and a breakfast nook that overlooked the beautifully landscaped backyard. But it felt cold and sterile, more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived and shared meals. Alexander and Benjamin appeared around 8 o'clock, both dressed in matching pajamas that looked like they came from an expensive children's boutique. At 12 and 10 years old, respectively, they were polite but distant, clearly unsure how to interact with the grandmother they saw only a few times a year. "Hi, Grandma Stella," Alexander said formally, as if greeting a visiting dignitary rather than his own family member. "Mom said you're staying in the garage. Is that fun?" The innocence of his question broke my heart. These boys had been raised in such luxury that the idea of sleeping in a garage seemed like an adventure rather than a humiliation. "It's certainly different," I replied, forcing a smile. "What would you like for breakfast?" As I prepared their cereal, organic expensive brands that came in boxes with more marketing text than actual nutrition information, I listened to them chatter about their upcoming day. They had private tennis lessons at 10, followed by a tutoring session with their academic coach, then soccer practice at 3. Their schedules were more packed than those of most adults I knew. "Don't you ever just play?" I asked Benjamin, who was methodically eating his cereal while reviewing flashcards for what appeared to be a middle school level science test. He looked puzzled by the question. "This is playing. Mom says structured activities help develop our potential." I thought about my own childhood, and Aaliyah's, filled with unstructured summer days exploring the woods behind our house, building forts out of couch cushions, and using our imaginations to create entire worlds from nothing more than cardboard boxes and crayons. These boys had every advantage money could buy, but they seemed to lack the simple joy of just being kids. Around 10:30, Aaliyah returned from her workout class, immediately launching into a flurry of phone calls and preparations for the evening's event. I watched her transform into what could only be described as a social warfare general, coordinating logistics with military precision. "The flowers need to be exactly 18 inches tall," she barked into her phone while simultaneously rearranging place settings on the dining room table. "And I specifically requested white roses, not cream. There's a difference, and my guests will notice." Everything had to be perfect. The wine selection, the appetizer presentation, even the playlist for background music. All of it was calibrated to create an impression of effortless sophistication and success. I offered to help several times throughout the morning, but each suggestion was politely declined with explanations that made it clear my assistance would be more hindrance than help. "Mother, I appreciate the offer, but the caterer has very specific protocols for food presentation," she said when I suggested I could help arrange the hors d'oeuvres. "And the florist is a professional who knows exactly how I want the centerpieces." Styled. The message was unmistakable. This was her world, with her standards, and I simply didn't have the sophistication or knowledge to contribute meaningfully. Around noon, while Aaliyah was upstairs on another business call, I found myself alone in the living room, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the backyard that had once been part of the rolling farmland George and I had loved so much. The professional landscaping was undeniably beautiful. Perfectly trimmed hedges, strategically placed garden lights, a stone patio with an outdoor kitchen that probably cost more than most people's cars. But I remembered this view when it was wild and natural, when George and I would walk through the tall grass at sunset, planning our future and dreaming about the family legacy we would build on this land. Now it was manicured perfection, designed for entertaining and impressing guests rather than for the simple pleasure of connecting with nature. "Grandma, why do you look sad?" I turned to find Benjamin standing behind me, having approached with the quiet curiosity that children possess when they sense adult emotions they don't understand. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," I said, pulling him into a hug. "I was just thinking about the old days, when this land looked very different." "You've been here before?" he asked, his eyes wide with interest. I realized I had said too much. "Well, I grew up not too far from here, and I used to explore this area when I was young." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. How could I explain to a 10-year-old that his grandmother owned the very ground his family's house was built on? That the success and status his parents were so proud of was literally founded on property that belonged to the woman they were currently housing in their garage? Before Benjamin could ask more questions, Aaliyah appeared at the top of the staircase, her voice sharp with irritation. "Benjamin, I thought I told you to let Grandma rest while I was on my calls. She's here to help with you and your brother, not to be bothered with constant questions. The implication stung. I wasn't here as a beloved grandmother spending quality time with her grandchildren. I was here as unpaid childcare, expected to manage the boys while staying out of the way of the real business of their lives." The afternoon passed in a blur of structured activities and careful avoidance of anything that might disrupt Aaliyah's preparations. I took the boys to the community park, where they played on equipment that was undoubtedly safer and more expensive than anything I had played on as a child, but somehow seemed less fun. Other parents and nannies at the park treated me with polite curiosity, clearly trying to figure out my role in the boys' lives. When Alexander introduced me as our grandma who's visiting from Millbrook, I caught the subtle shift in their expressions. Millbrook might only be 40 minutes away, but in their world, it might as well have been another planet. When we returned to the house around 4 o'clock, the transformation for the evening's dinner party was already underway. Florists were arranging elaborate centerpieces, caterers were setting up staging areas in the kitchen, and Aaliyah was directing traffic with the intensity of a film director on a crucial scene. "Mother, could you please keep the boys upstairs for the rest of the afternoon?" she asked without looking up from a checklist that appeared to be several pages long. "The staff needs to work without distractions, and I need to focus on final preparations." I gathered the boys and headed upstairs, feeling more like hired help than family. As we climbed the steps, I could hear Aaliyah on the phone with Jacob, discussing the guest list and strategic seating arrangements. "Make sure you spend extra time with the Andersons," she was saying. "Margaret Anderson sits on the board of the country club, and if we can get her support for your membership application, it would be huge for your career." Everything was calculated. every relationship was evaluated for its potential benefit. Every interaction was an opportunity to advance their social standing or professional prospects. As I helped the boys with their homework in Alexander's room, I found myself thinking about the legal documents I had signed all those years ago. The lease agreement that gave Morrison's development company the right to build on my land, with the crucial clause that Patricia Wells had insisted on including. I could reclaim any individual lot if I had been personally mistreated or discriminated against by the residents of that lot. At the time, it had seemed like legal overkill, a provision we would never need to use. But as I sat in my grandson's bedroom, having been relegated to the garage and treated like an inconvenient obligation rather than a cherished family member, that clause began to feel less like legal paranoia and more like prophetic wisdom. The question was, what would happen if I actually used it? The breaking point came that evening, during what should have been a moment of family connection, but instead became the final confirmation that I had become nothing more than an inconvenient obligation in my daughter's perfectly orchestrated life. By 6 o'clock, the house had been transformed into something that belonged in a luxury magazine spread. Every surface gleamed, fresh flowers filled crystal vases throughout the main floor, and the dining room table was set with china and crystal that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The caterers moved through the kitchen with professional efficiency, preparing what Aaliyah had described as an elevated dining experience that will showcase our sophisticated palate. I had been banished upstairs with the boys since 4, watching through Alexander's bedroom window as expensive cars began arriving in the circular driveway. Jacob's colleagues and their wives emerged from BMWs, Mercedes, and Lexuses, all dressed in the kind of effortlessly expensive attire that only comes from having unlimited shopping budgets and personal stylists. "Why can't we meet Dad's work friends?" Benjamin asked, pressing his face against the window to get a better view of the guests. "Mom says they're here for grown-up business," Alexander replied with the resigned tone of a child who had learned not to question such explanations. "She says we need to be invisible tonight." Invisible. That word hit me like a physical blow. These boys, my grandsons, had been taught that their very existence was something to be hidden when it might interfere with their parents' social climbing. Around 7:30, as the sounds of sophisticated conversation and practiced laughter drifted up from the main floor, Aaliyah appeared in the doorway of Alexander's room. She was stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, her hair and makeup professionally styled to perfection. "Boys, it's time for bed," she announced, though both children were clearly wide awake and curious about the party happening downstairs. "But Mom, it's Saturday night," Alexander protested. "Can't we stay up a little later?" "Absolutely not. This is an important business event, and I need you both asleep so the house can be completely quiet." She turned to me with the same brisk efficiency she had shown the caterers. "Mother, once they're in bed, I need you to stay in the garage for the remainder of the evening. Our guests may want a tour of the house, and I can't have unexpected encounters. Unexpected encounters. As if my presence in my own daughter's home was some kind of embarrassing accident that needed to be prevented." "Aaliyah," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. "I'm your mother. Surely you can introduce me to your guests as your family member who's visiting for the weekend." Her expression tightened with barely concealed irritation. "Mother, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. These people are extremely important to Jacob's career. They have certain expectations about the kind of families they associate with, and I can't afford to have anything disrupt the evening." The implication was crystal clear. I was the kind of person who would disrupt a sophisticated gathering simply by existing. "What exactly are you afraid I might do?" I asked, standing up from where I had been sitting on Alexander's bed. "Embarrass you by mentioning that I work at a general store? Talk about my modest apartment in Millbrook? Remind people that you come from humble beginnings?" "That's not what this is about," she snapped. then immediately lowered her voice and glanced toward the boys who were watching our exchange with wide, worried eyes. "We'll discuss this later. Right now, I need you to cooperate." But I was done cooperating. 20 years of watching my daughter transform into someone I barely recognized. 20 years of being gradually erased from her narrative. 20 years of accepting treatment that diminished my worth and dignity. It all crystallized in that moment into something that felt like clarity. "No," I said simply. Aaliyah blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "Excuse me?" I said no. "I'm not going to hide in your garage like some shameful secret while you entertain people who apparently can't handle the knowledge that you have a mother." Her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mother, you're being completely unreasonable. This is my home, and I'm asking you to respect my wishes for one evening." "Your home," I repeated, the irony of those words hitting me with fresh force. "Built on land that you assume belongs to you, filled with people you hope will advance your social status, designed to showcase a success that you've built by rejecting everything and everyone that helped make you who you are." "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded. Before I could answer, Jacob's voice called from downstairs. "Aaliyah, the Andersons are asking about the house tour you promised." She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath to compose herself. When she opened them, her expression had hardened into something I barely recognized. "We will continue this conversation tomorrow," she said in a voice that could have frozen water. "Tonight, you will stay in the garage or you will leave. Those are your only options." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in my grandson's bedroom, shaking with a combination of hurt and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. "Grandma, are you okay?" Benjamin asked softly, reaching out to take my hand. I looked down at his concerned face, then at Alexander, who was watching me with the kind of worried expression that no 12-year-old should have to wear when observing adult conflict. These beautiful boys had been caught in the middle of their mother's social ambitions and their grandmother's growing realization that she had been systematically devalued and dismissed. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied, forcing a smile. "Let's get you both ready for bed." As I helped them with their bedtime routines, I could hear the party in full swing downstairs. Aaliyah's laughter, bright and practiced, rang out above the sophisticated murmur of conversation. Jacob's voice carried occasionally, regaling guests with stories about his latest real estate conquests and development projects. They were performing their success, showcasing their sophisticated lifestyle, impressing people whose approval they desperately craved. And they were doing it all on land that belonged to me, in a house that existed only because I had allowed it to be built, with a confidence and arrogance that came from not knowing how precarious their position actually was. After tucking the boys into their beds and promising them pancakes for breakfast, a promise I wasn't sure I'd be allowed to keep, I made my way back toward the garage. But instead of immediately retreating to my makeshift bedroom, I paused, at the top of the stairs, listening to the conversation floating up from the elegant dinner party below. "This house is absolutely magnificent," a woman's voice was saying. "Jacob, you and Aaliyah have created something truly special here." "Thank you, Margaret," Jacob replied, his voice warm with pride. "We fell in love with this property the moment we saw it. The location, the mature trees, the privacy, it was everything we had dreamed of. And the land values in Oakwood Hills just keep climbing," another man added. "You two were smart to get in early. This property must be worth 3 times what you paid for it." "Actually," Aaliyah's voice joined the conversation, "we've had it appraised recently, and it's worth considerably more than that. The land alone is valued at over $2 million. My land. Worth over $2 million. Land that I had purchased with George for $35,000 back when it was just farmland and dreams. You must feel so secure," Margaret continued, "owning such valuable property in such an exclusive community." "Oh, we do," Aaliyah replied with a laugh that sounded like crystal bells. There's something wonderful about knowing that you own the very ground beneath your feet, that you've built something lasting and valuable that can't be taken away. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Standing at the top of those stairs, listening to my daughter boast about owning land that actually belonged to me, watching her perform a version of success that was built entirely on my foundation, while she simultaneously treated me like an embarrassing burden to be hidden away. It was more than I could bear. The legal clause that Patricia Wells had insisted on including in the lease agreement suddenly felt less like paranoia and more like destiny. I could reclaim any individual lot if I had been personally mistreated or discriminated against by the residents of that lot. Well, I had certainly been mistreated. I had been relegated to a garage, told to hide from guests, dismissed as an embarrassment, and treated like unwanted baggage rather than a cherished family member. And all of this on property that I owned, by people who had no idea how completely their world depended on my continued generosity. As I finally made my way to the garage, listening to the continued sounds of the party that I had been banned from attending, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time for my daughter to learn exactly who owned the foundation of her perfect life. It was time for her to understand that the security she bragged about was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the woman she had just banished to sleep next to her luxury cars. And it was time for me to stop enabling behavior that had gone from hurtful to absolutely inexcusable. Tomorrow, I decided, as I lay down on that narrow cot for what I promised myself would be the last time, I would make some phone calls. Patricia Wells needed to know that the mistreatment clause in our agreement had been triggered. The lease that allowed Morrison's development company to build on my land needed to be reviewed. And my daughter needed to learn that sometimes the person you step on has the power to shake the very foundation of your world. The party continued until well past midnight, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake planning exactly how I would reclaim not just my dignity, but my property. And for the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten: the power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Sunday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem possible. I woke up in that garage for what I had promised myself would be the last time, my back aching from the narrow cot, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. The sounds of the household stirring, Jacob's early morning workout routine, Aaliyah's coffee preparation ritual, the boys' muffled voices as they got ready for the day. All of it felt different now that I had made my decision. Had spent the sleepless hours of the night crafting a plan that would accomplish several goals. Reclaim my dignity, teach my daughter a long overdue lesson about respect and humility, and most importantly, position myself to rebuild a genuine relationship with my grandsons based on truth rather than the careful lies their parents had constructed around my existence. By 7 a.m., I was dressed and ready, having quietly gathered my few belongings and packed them into my overnight bag. Before anyone else was awake, I slipped out of the garage through the side door and walked to my car, breathing in the fresh morning air of the property that my late husband and I had once dreamed would be our family legacy. My first stop was the Westfield Grand Hotel, the most prestigious accommodation in the area, and the kind of place where Aaliyah took her wealthy friends for special occasions. If I was going to make a statement, it needed to be made from a position of undeniable authority and sophistication. The young man at the registration desk initially looked skeptical when I approached in my modest clothes, carrying a single overnight bag. But when I requested their finest suite and handed over the platinum credit card that my financial advisor had suggested I obtain after my real estate investments had begun generating substantial income, his demeanor shifted immediately. "Of course, Mrs. Wright," he said with newfound respect. "The presidential suite is available, and it comes with a personal concierge service. Will you be hosting any events during your stay?" "Possibly," I replied with a smile that felt more confident than any expression I had worn in years. "I may need to arrange some meetings with legal professionals and real estate executives." Could you provide me with a list of the finest services in the area? Within an hour, I was settled into a suite that was larger and more luxurious than Aaliyah's entire first apartment after college. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the furnishings were the kind of understated elegance that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. More importantly, the suite came with a business center and concierge services that would allow me to execute my plan with the kind of professional efficiency that would have impressed even Jacob's most demanding clients. My first call was to Patricia Wells, the real estate attorney who had helped me navigate the original lease agreement with Morrison's development company. Despite it being a Sunday morning, she answered her emergency line immediately, a privilege that came with being one of her most valuable clients. "Stella, what can I do for you?" Patricia's voice was alert and professional, even at 8 o'clock, on a weekend morning. "I need to exercise the reclamation clause we included in the Oakwood Hills lease agreement," I said without preamble. "The mistreatment provision has been triggered." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia had been my attorney for over a decade, handling not just the Oakwood Hills situation, but also helping me manage the various real estate investments that had grown from my original land holdings. She knew me well enough to understand that I wouldn't make such a request lightly. "Can you document the mistreatment?" she asked, her voice taking on the focused tone of a lawyer preparing for battle. "Extensively. I was relegated to sleeping in a garage, banned from social gatherings in my own family home, and treated as an embarrassment to be hidden from guests. I have witnesses. My grandsons observed much of the treatment." "That should be more than sufficient," Patricia confirmed. "I can have the reclamation papers drawn up and served by tomorrow afternoon. But Stella, are you sure about this? Once we trigger the clause, there's no going back. The current residents will have 60 days to vacate the property." I looked out the hotel window at the city below, thinking about my grandsons' confused faces as they watched their mother treat me like an unwelcome burden, remembering the sound of Aaliyah bragging about owning land that actually belonged to me. "I'm absolutely certain," I said, "but I want to handle the notification personally, in my own way." "Of course. I'll prepare all the documentation and have it ready for your review. Do you want me to coordinate with Morrison's company about the lease termination?" "Not yet. I want to speak with my daughter first, give her a chance to understand the situation before it becomes a legal matter involving third parties." After ending the call with Patricia, I spent the next hour making additional arrangements. I hired a private investigator to document the current condition and value of the property, ensuring that I would have comprehensive records for any future legal proceedings. I arranged for a property management company to assess the house and grounds, ostensibly for insurance purposes, but actually to establish the full scope of improvements that had been made to my land. Most importantly, I called Martin Phillips, a financial consultant who specialized in high-net-worth family dynamics. If I was going to rebuild my relationship with Aaliyah and the boys, I needed to do it in a way that addressed the underlying issues of money, power, and respect that had poisoned our family bonds. "Mrs. Wright," Martin said when I explained the situation, "what you're describing is unfortunately common in families where wealth creates power imbalances. The key is to use your position not to punish, but to educate and ultimately heal." "That's exactly what I'm hoping to accomplish," I replied. "I want my daughter to understand that true security comes from relationships, not just property values. But first, she needs to learn that the security she's been taking for granted was never really hers to begin with." By noon, I had assembled a team of professionals who would help me execute a plan that was both strategic and compassionate. The goal wasn't to destroy Aaliyah's life, but to shock her into recognizing how completely she had lost sight of what actually mattered. My phone rang around 1 o'clock. Aaliyah's name appeared on the screen, and I could imagine her panic when she discovered that I had left without explanation, taking my belongings and disappearing from her carefully controlled environment. "Mother, where are you?" Her voice was tight with anxiety and barely concealed irritation. I went to check on you this morning, and you were gone. The boys are asking about the pancakes you promised them. The fact that she mentioned the boys' disappointment rather than any concern for my well-being told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. I'm staying at the Westfield Grand Hotel, I replied calmly. I decided that sleeping in garages was no longer acceptable, regardless of the circumstances. The Westfield Grand? I could hear the surprise in her voice. The hotel was far beyond what she assumed I could afford, which meant she was already beginning to question her assumptions about my financial situation. Mother, that place costs more per night than most people make in a week. I'm aware of the rates, I said simply. I'm quite comfortable with the expense. There was a long pause as she processed this information, trying to reconcile her image of her financially struggling mother with the reality of someone who could casually afford luxury accommodations. Well, you've made your point, she said finally, her tone attempting to regain its usual authority. You're upset about last night, and I understand that, but you can't just disappear without explanation. Jacob and I have obligations, and we need to know that you're going to be responsible about your commitments to help with the boys. The audacity of her response, treating my departure as an inconvenience to her schedule rather than a response to her inexcusable treatment, confirmed that more dramatic measures would be necessary. Aaliyah, I said, my voice taking on a tone I hadn't used since she was a teenager testing boundaries. I think it's time we had a conversation about responsibility, commitments, and exactly who owes what to whom in this family. What's that supposed to mean? It means that tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'll be at your house with some people I'd like you to meet. Legal professionals who have some very interesting information about your property and your living situation. I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to figure out what I could possibly mean by that. Mother, you're being dramatic and cryptic, and I don't have time for games. If you have something to say, just say it. Tomorrow at 10, I repeated. Make sure Jacob is there as well. And Aaliyah, you might want to clear your schedule for the rest of the day. This conversation is going to take a while. I hung up before she could respond, then immediately called Patricia to confirm that all the documentation would be ready for the morning meeting. As I sat in that luxurious hotel suite, looking out at a view that rivaled anything Aaliyah could see from her supposedly exclusive home, I felt a sense of anticipation that I hadn't experienced in decades. For too long, I had allowed myself to be diminished, marginalized, and treated as less than I was worth. Tomorrow, my daughter would learn that the foundation of her perfect life had always belonged to the woman she had been so eager to hide away. And perhaps, if I handled it correctly, that revelation would be the beginning of building something real between us. A relationship based on mutual respect rather than her misguided shame about our shared history. The game was about to change, and for the first time in years, I held all the cards. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes everything feel possible. I woke up in the presidential suite of the Westfield Grand Hotel, feeling more rested than I had in years, despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. After a room service breakfast that cost more than Aaliyah probably assumed I spent on groceries in a week, I prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most important conversation of our relationship. Patricia Wells arrived at 9:30, carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough legal documentation to permanently alter my daughter's understanding of her place in the world. She was accompanied by Robert Chen, a real estate appraiser who specialized in high-value properties, and Margaret Foster, a property management expert who would help explain the full implications of the situation we were about to reveal. "Are you ready for this, Stella?" Patricia asked as we reviewed the final documents in the hotel's private conference room. "Once we show them these papers, there's no going back to the way things were." I looked out the window toward Oakwood Hills, where I could just make out the roofline of the house that had become a symbol of my daughter's success and my own diminished status in her life. "I've been ready for this conversation for 20 years, I replied. "The only question is whether Aaliyah is ready to hear the truth." We arrived at the house precisely at 10 o'clock, our professional caravan looking official enough to command immediate attention. Jacob's BMW and Aaliyah's Mercedes were both in the driveway, and I could see faces at the windows as our group approached the front door. Aaliyah answered the bell, her expression a mixture of confusion and barely concealed irritation. She was dressed in what I recognized as her serious business outfit, a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair and makeup perfect despite the early hour. "Mother, what is this about?" she demanded, looking past me to the three professionals standing behind me with their briefcases and official demeanor. "Who are these people? And why do they need to be involved in whatever family discussion you think we need to have?" "These are my advisors," I replied calmly. "Patricia Wells, my real estate attorney, Robert Chen, my property appraiser, and Margaret Foster, who manages my real estate portfolio. I thought it would be helpful to have professional guidance for the conversation we're about to have." The words, "my real estate portfolio," clearly caught her off guard. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed as she tried to process this information, clearly struggling to reconcile her image of her financially limited mother with someone who apparently required a team of expensive professionals. Jacob appeared behind her, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to sharp attention as he registered the professional nature of our group. "Mrs. Wright," he said with the kind of practiced charm that had probably served him well in business negotiations. "This is quite a surprise. What can we do for you?" "You can invite us in," I replied. "We have some important information to share about your property situation." They led us into the living room where I had been banned from appearing just 2 nights earlier. The space looked different in the morning light, still impressive, but somehow less intimidating now that I understood the true nature of my relationship to this house and everything in it. "Would anyone like coffee?" Aaliyah offered, clearly trying to regain control of the situation through hostess duties. "That won't be necessary," Patricia said, settling into one of the expensive leather chairs and opening her briefcase. "This shouldn't take long, but it is rather important." Jacob and Aaliyah sat across from us on the sofa, their body language tense with the kind of anxiety that comes from sensing that something significant is about to shift but not knowing what or how. "I'm going to be direct," I said, looking at my daughter with a mixture of love and sadness. "Aaliyah, you've spent the last 20 years building what you consider to be a successful, independent life. You've worked hard, made smart decisions, and created something you're proud of. But there's something you don't know about the foundation of that success." "Mother, what are you talking about?" Aaliyah's voice carried a warning tone, as if she could sense that whatever I was about to say would challenge her carefully constructed worldview. I gestured to Patricia, who withdrew a thick folder from her briefcase and placed it on the coffee table between us. "This house," I continued, "this beautiful home that you've worked so hard to afford, sits on land that belongs to me. Land that my late husband George and I purchased in 1987 for $35,000, long before Oakwood Hills existed, when it was nothing but farmland and dreams." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Jacob and Aaliyah stared at me as if I had just announced that I was actually an alien visitor from another planet. "That's impossible," Jacob said finally, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "We bought this property directly from Morrison Development. We have a clear title, a mortgage, deed records." "You have a lease agreement," Patricia interrupted, opening the folder to reveal official documents with impressive legal seals. Morrison Development never actually owned this land. They purchased development rights and created a complex legal arrangement that allowed them to build homes and sell them to buyers like you. But the underlying land ownership never transferred. She spread several documents across the coffee table. The original deed showing George Holmes and Stella Wright as purchasers of the 15-acre tract, the lease agreement that allowed Morrison to develop the property, and most importantly, the current legal status showing that I retained ultimate ownership with specific reclamation rights. Aaliyah's face had gone pale as she stared at the papers, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for one of the documents. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she whispered. "We've been paying a mortgage for over 10 years. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in improvements. We have equity. You have a beautiful home," I said gently. "But you have it because I allowed it to be built here. The lease agreement includes a clause that permits me to reclaim any individual lot under specific circumstances." Jacob's business instincts kicked in, and he leaned forward with the aggressive posture of someone preparing to negotiate. "What kind of circumstances? And what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Robert Chen, the appraiser, spoke up for the first time. "The lease includes a provision for reclamation if the property owner has been personally mistreated or discriminated against by the residents of any specific lot." He consulted his notes. "Mrs. Wright has documented extensive mistreatment during her recent visit, including being forced to sleep in inappropriate accommodations and being excluded from family gatherings due to perceived social embarrassment." The weight of realization was beginning to settle on Aaliyah's face. She looked around the living room as if seeing it for the first time, understanding that every stick of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration, every symbol of her success existed only because of the generosity of the woman she had been treating like an unwelcome burden. "You're saying," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "that when I made you sleep in the garage, I was humiliating my own landlord?" "You were humiliating your mother," I corrected. "The property ownership is secondary to that. But yes, you were treating the person who literally owns the ground beneath your feet as if she were an embarrassment to be hidden away." Jacob stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard he had spent thousands of dollars landscaping. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. "Money? A formal apology? Some kind of acknowledgement?" "I want my daughter back," I said simply. "I want a relationship with my grandsons that isn't managed and controlled and limited by your social anxieties. I want to be treated like a human being worthy of basic respect, regardless of my bank account or my zip code." Margaret Foster opened her own folder, revealing additional documents. "Mrs. Wright has asked me to prepare a comprehensive property management plan," she said. "She has several options available to her, ranging from immediate reclamation to restructured lease agreements that would allow current residents to remain under modified terms." Aaliyah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You could kick us out. You could take our home away." "I could," I confirmed. "The legal right is absolutely clear, but that's not what I want to do. What I want is for you to understand that the security you've been bragging about, the foundation you've been building your identity on, was never really yours. It was a gift you didn't even know you were receiving." I leaned forward, looking directly into my daughter's eyes. 20 years ago, when you started pulling away from me because you were ashamed of our modest lifestyle, I could have told you that I owned some of the most valuable property in the county. But I kept quiet because I hoped you would find your way back to valuing family relationships over material status. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, and Aaliyah buried her face in her hands. "Oh God," she sobbed. "What have I done? What kind of person treats their mother like that?" Jacob remained standing by the window, his mind clearly racing through the financial implications of what we had just revealed. But for the first time in our 20-year relationship, his opinion was the least important thing in the room. What mattered was that my daughter was finally beginning to understand the true cost of the choices she had made. And perhaps, if we handled this carefully, we could begin building something real between us again. The revelation was complete. Now came the much harder work of figuring out how to heal decades of damage and create a relationship based on truth instead of the careful lies that had driven us apart. The immediate aftermath of the revelation created a tension so thick it felt like the air itself had changed. Aaliyah sat on her expensive sofa, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, while Jacob stood frozen by the window, his businessman's mind clearly racing through calculations of financial exposure and legal vulnerability. Patricia Wells broke the silence with the kind of professional calm that comes from decades of delivering life-changing news to unprepared recipients. "I want to be clear about the timeline," she said, consulting her notes. "Mrs. Wright has 60 days from the date of formal notice to decide whether to exercise her reclamation rights. However, she's asked me to explore alternatives that might allow for a more collaborative resolution." "Collaborative resolution," Jacob repeated, finally turning from the window. His expression had shifted into the focused intensity he probably used in high-stakes business negotiations. "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret Foster opened another folder, revealing a different set of documents. "Mrs. Wright owns not just this lot, but approximately 40% of the prime real estate in Oakwood Hills. Her total property holdings in this development are valued at just over $8 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. I watched my daughter's face as she processed the implications. Not just that I owned their home, but that I was, by any reasonable measure, wealthier than she and Jacob had ever dreamed of. Becoming. $8 million, Aaliyah whispered, looking at me as if I were a stranger. "You're worth $8 million, and you've been letting me treat you like someone whose worth was determined by her bank account rather than her character," I finished gently. "Yes, that's exactly what I've been doing, and it's exactly what I needed to stop doing." Robert Chen, the appraiser, spread out a detailed map of Oakwood Hills, with different properties marked in various colors. "The red properties are those owned directly by Mrs. Wright," he explained. "As you can see, they include not just individual lots, but also the common areas, the entrance gatehouse, and the small commercial district that serves the community." Jacob studied the map with the intensity of someone discovering that the rules of a game he thought he understood had been completely different all along. "You own the gatehouse," he said slowly. "The security system, the entrance protocols, the visitor policies, all administered by a property management company that reports to me," I confirmed, "including the guest registration system that required me to get a visitor's pass to enter my own property this past weekend." The irony of that detail seemed to hit Aaliyah like a physical blow. She looked up at me with an expression of such profound shame that I felt my resolve waver for a moment. "Mother," she began, her voice breaking, "I made you register as a visitor to come to your own land. I made you carry a badge that said, 'Visitor expires Sunday,' on property that belongs to you." Before I could respond, there was a knock at our front door. Through the window, I could see a sleek black town car in the driveway, and Jacob's face immediately tensed with recognition. "That's the Morrison Company car," he said, moving toward the door. "Calvin Morrison himself. He must have heard about this morning's meeting." Indeed, Calvin Morrison stood on the doorstep, accompanied by a woman in an expensive suit who was clearly his attorney. Morrison was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of practiced charm that had probably served him well in convincing wealthy families to invest in his developments. "Jacob, Aaliyah," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I received some concerning information this morning about a potential legal issue affecting your property." He stepped into the foyer and immediately noticed our group in the living room, his gaze settling on Patricia with the wary recognition of one attorney identifying another. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia said, rising from her chair. "How timely. We're just discussing the lease agreements your company has with Mrs. Wright." Morrison's practiced composure slipped slightly as he looked at me, really looked at me, for what was probably the first time since he had tried to lowball me for my land all those years ago. "Mrs. Wright," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware. You were involved in today's discussions. Perhaps we should schedule a separate meeting to address any concerns you might have." "Oh, I think this is the perfect time," I replied, gesturing for him to join our circle. "In fact, your presence might help clarify some things for my daughter and her husband." Margaret Foster handed Morrison a copy of the property ownership documents, watching his face carefully as he reviewed them. His attorney leaned over his shoulder, and I could see the exact moment when they both realized the full scope of what they were looking at. As you can see, Patricia explained to the room, Mrs. Wright's lease agreement with Morrison Development includes some very specific performance clauses. The company has been operating under the assumption that they could eventually purchase the underlying land, but no such option exists in the contract. Morrison's attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, and his expression became increasingly grave as he continued reading. "There's more," Robert Chen added, consulting his appraisal documents. "Mrs. Wright's property has appreciated far beyond what anyone anticipated when the original lease was signed. The current market value represents roughly a 2,000% increase from her original purchase price." Aaliyah looked back and forth between Morrison and me, beginning to understand that this conversation involved far more than just our family dynamics. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, "when we bought this house, you told us we were purchasing the land as well as the structure. Are you saying that wasn't true?" Morrison's practiced smile became strained. "The language in your purchase agreement was very specific about development rights and long-term occupancy privileges, all perfectly legal and properly disclosed. In 17 pages of legal documentation that you knew most buyers wouldn't read carefully," Patricia interjected, "including the section that clearly states the land ownership remains with the original title holder." Jacob had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Are you telling me that our entire mortgage, all of our equity, the refinancing we did last year to fund the kitchen renovation, none of that actually increased our ownership of anything?" "You own a beautiful house," Morrison said carefully. "And you have a lease that under normal circumstances would allow you to enjoy that house for decades to come." "Under normal circumstances," I repeated. "But we're not dealing with normal circumstances anymore, are we?" The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Morrison and his attorney were clearly calculating their potential liability. Jacob was probably running mental numbers on their financial exposure. Aaliyah was staring at me with a mixture of awe, shame, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "Mrs. Wright," Morrison said finally, "I think it would be beneficial for all parties if we could discuss a more permanent resolution to this situation. Perhaps we could arrange for my company to purchase your land holdings at current market value, which would give the residents actual ownership of their properties." I smiled at him with the same polite expression I had perfected during decades of dealing with people who underestimated me. "Mr. Morrison," I replied, "that's a very generous offer, but I'm not interested in selling. I'm interested in ensuring that my property is managed according to my values and priorities. And one of my highest priorities is that residents treat each other and their guests with basic human dignity and respect." The pointed look I gave Aaliyah made it clear that this wasn't just about abstract principles. Morrison's attorney leaned over to whisper something else, and his expression became even more serious. "There is one more thing we should discuss," Patricia said, producing yet another document from her seemingly endless briefcase. "Mrs. Wright has decided to make some changes to the property management structure. Effective immediately, she'll be taking a more active role in overseeing the community standards and resident relations." The meaning was clear. I wasn't just going to remain a silent landowner collecting modest lease payments. I was going to be an active presence in the community that had unknowingly been built on my generosity. For Aaliyah and Jacob, this meant that the mother and mother-in-law they had been treating as an embarrassing inconvenience was about to become the most powerful person in their exclusive neighborhood. And for the first time in 20 years, I was going to have the leverage I needed to build genuine relationships with my family, based on truth rather than the careful management of my supposed limitations. The external validation was complete. Now, everyone in the room understood exactly who held the real power in this situation. The question was, what would we all do with that knowledge? After Morrison and his attorney left, their hasty departure accompanied by promises to review all documentation and be in touch soon, the four of us sat in the living room surrounded by the legal papers that had just rewritten the fundamental assumptions of my daughter's life. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 20 years of misunderstandings and the shock of revelations that changed everything. It was Aaliyah who finally broke the quiet, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking at her hands rather than at me. "If you've had this kind of money, this kind of power, all these years, why did you let me treat you the way I did? Why didn't you tell me?" The question I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, seeing past the expensive clothes and professional makeup to the confused, hurt young woman underneath. "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have," I said simply. "And because I hoped that someday you would remember that the woman who raised you, who sacrificed for you, who loved you unconditionally, was worth respecting regardless of her bank account." Patricia and the other professionals had gathered their papers and excused themselves, understanding that what needed to happen next was a family conversation that no amount of legal expertise could facilitate. Jacob remained seated on the sofa, but I could see him processing the information with the calculating mind of someone trying to figure out how this new reality would affect his own position. "But I hurt you," Aaliyah continued, tears beginning to flow again. "For years and years I hurt you. I made you feel small and unimportant and embarrassing. I treated you like you were something to be ashamed of instead of—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Instead of the woman who made it possible for you to have everything you're so proud of," I completed gently. "Yes, you did hurt me. More than you may ever fully understand." I moved from my chair to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough to reach out and take her hand if she would let me. "Do you want to know the worst part?" I continued. "It wasn't the way you introduced me as your childhood nanny instead of your mother. It wasn't even the garage this weekend, humiliating as that was. The worst part was watching you teach your sons to be ashamed of their grandmother, to see me as someone who didn't quite belong in your perfect world." Aaliyah's shoulders shook as the full weight of her behavior settled on her. Alexander asked, "Me last year why you never come to his soccer games," she whispered. "He said all the other kids' grandparents came to watch them play. And I told him you were too busy with your own life to be bothered with family activities." The admission hit me like a physical blow. "You made my own grandsons. Think I didn't care about them?" "I was protecting my image," she said, the words coming out in a rush of self-recrimination. "I was so terrified that someone would find out I came from humble beginnings, that my mother worked in a general store and lived in a modest apartment. I thought if people knew the truth about my background, they would think less of me, that I wouldn't belong in their world." Jacob finally spoke up, his voice careful and measured. "Aaliyah, your mother's background was never the problem. The problem was your shame about it." It was perhaps the most insightful thing I had ever heard him say, and the most critical he had ever been of his wife's behavior in my presence. Aaliyah turned to look at him, surprised by his directness. "You always supported me in keeping distance from my mother. You never objected when I made excuses to avoid visits, or when I limited the children's contact with her. Because I thought she was—" Jacob paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase his thoughts tactfully. "I thought she was financially dependent and maybe looking for help we couldn't afford to give. I thought keeping some distance was protecting our family's stability." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You thought I was going to ask you for money? Jacob, in all the years you've known me, when have I ever asked for financial assistance? When have I ever suggested that you owed me anything?" He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Never," he admitted. "You never did any of those things. I made assumptions based on on my own prejudices about people from small towns and modest backgrounds. On my prejudices, Aaliyah corrected, her voice thick with shame. You made assumptions based on what I told you about my mother and my childhood. I was the one who painted that picture, who made it seem like my background was something to overcome rather than something to be proud of. The honesty in the room was becoming almost overwhelming. But I knew we needed to go deeper if we were going to have any chance of rebuilding something real between us. Aaliyah, I said carefully, I need you to help me understand something. When did you start believing that love was conditional on status? When did you decide that your worth as a person was determined by your zip code and your bank account? Was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn that existed because of my land, my decisions, my generosity that she had never known to appreciate. I think it started in college, she said finally. I was surrounded by kids who talked casually about things I had never experienced: spring break trips to Europe, summer houses, trust funds, parents who were doctors and lawyers and business executives. And I felt like such an imposter. So you decided to become what you thought they wanted you to be? I decided to become what I thought I needed to be to deserve their respect, she corrected. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that meant leaving behind everything that reminded me of where I came from, including you. The pain in her voice was genuine, and I could see that she was finally beginning to understand the true cost of the choices she had made. The irony, I said softly, is that the thing you were most ashamed of, your modest background, was built on something more valuable than most of your wealthy friends could ever imagine. Your father and I didn't just work hard and save money. We invested in the future, in land, in something lasting. We built the foundation for exactly the kind of success you were so desperate to achieve. Jacob looked up sharply at that. You're saying that Aaliyah's college education, this house, the lifestyle we've built, it was all possible because of investments you and your husband made decades ago? I'm saying that the land your house sits on, the appreciation in property values that has made you feel so financially secure, the exclusive address that gives you so much social confidence, all of it exists because of decisions George and I made when we were young parents trying to build something lasting for our daughter. Aaliyah buried her face in her hands. Oh God, Mom, I've been so stupid, so incredibly, horribly stupid. Not stupid, I corrected. Confused about what really matters. Scared of not being enough. Human, in the most painful ways. I reached over and gently pulled her hands away from her face, making her look at me. But here's what I need you to understand, I continued. The money, the land, the property values, none of that is what I care about most. What I care about is having a relationship with my daughter and my grandsons that's based on love and honesty instead of shame and pretense. Even after everything I've done, even after the way I've treated you, especially after everything you've done, I said firmly. Because now we have a chance to start over, with all the cards on the table. No more secrets, no more assumptions, no more shame about who we are or where we come from. Jacob cleared his throat. Mrs. Wright, Stella, I owe you an enormous apology. I've spent years judging you based on incomplete information and my own biases. I've supported my wife in behavior that was not only unkind but completely unjustified. Thank you for saying that, Jacob. But the real question is, what are we going to do differently going forward? The room fell quiet again, as all three of us contemplated the magnitude of the changes that would be required to build something healthy. From the wreckage of our previous relationship, the truth-telling had been painful but necessary. Now came the even harder work of figuring out how to translate this new understanding into a genuine, lasting connection between people who had been strangers to each other for far too long. The afternoon light had shifted by the time we finally began to discuss the practical steps toward rebuilding our relationship. The legal documents had been put away, the professional advisors had departed, and what remained was a mother and daughter who needed to figure out how to love each other, authentically for the first time in decades. "I want to move back to Millbrook," Aaliyah said suddenly, the words surprising all of us, including herself. "Not permanently, but I want to spend time there again. I want the boys to see where their mother grew up, to understand that there's nothing shameful about our roots." Jacob looked concerned. "Aaliyah, let's think about this rationally. Your life is here, your commitments, the boys' schools." "The boys go to private school," she interrupted. "They can handle a few weeks away, especially during summer break. And my commitments here," she gestured around the immaculate living room, "most of them are about maintaining an image that I'm not sure I want to maintain anymore." I felt a flutter of hope in my chest, but I tried to keep my expectations measured. "What would you want to do in Millbrook?" "I want to help at Henderson's General Store if they'll have me. I want to remember what it feels like to work with my hands, to serve people who aren't worried about impressing anyone." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I want Alexander and Benjamin to meet Teresa, your neighbor with the enchiladas. I want them to help in your garden and understand that wealth isn't just about bank accounts." Jacob was clearly struggling with this vision. "And what about our life here? Our obligations, our social connections?" "What about them?" Aaliyah asked, turning to face her husband directly. "Jacob, when was the last time you enjoyed one of those social events? When was the last time you came home from a networking dinner feeling fulfilled instead of exhausted?" It was a fair question, and I could see Jacob grappling with the honest answer. "I thought those connections were building something meaningful," he said slowly. "Security for our family, opportunities for advancement." "They were building something," I said gently. "But perhaps not what you intended. They were building walls between you and the people who actually matter." We talked for another hour about practical changes that could begin to heal the damage. Aaliyah wanted to bring the boys to Millbrook the following weekend, to let them spend real time with me in my own environment. Jacob, after considerable internal struggle, agreed to step back from some of the social obligations that had consumed so much of their time and energy. "There's something else," Aaliyah said as the conversation began to wind down. "I want to write letters to Alexander and Benjamin, explaining why their grandmother hasn't been more present in their lives. I want them to understand that it was my failing, not yours, and that we're going to do better going forward." The offer touched me deeply. That would mean everything to me. "And I want to set up college funds for them," Jacob added, "separate from whatever financial arrangements you make. Not because we have to, but because I want them to understand that their parents value education and family legacy the way you and George did." It was a thoughtful gesture, one that suggested Jacob was beginning to understand the difference between financial transactions and family investment. As the day drew to a close, Aaliyah walked me to my car. Not the old Honda I had driven on Friday, but the luxury sedan that Patricia had arranged for me to use during my stay at the Westfield Grand. "Mom," she said, using the word that sounded strange after years of formal mother. "I know this is going to take time. I know I can't undo 20 years of hurtful behavior with one conversation." "No," I agreed. "But you can begin building 20 years of better behavior starting today." She hugged me then, really hugged me, without the stiff formality that had characterized our physical contact for so long. "I love you," she whispered against my shoulder. "I never stopped loving you, even when I was too proud and scared to show it properly." "I love you too, sweetheart. Always have, always will." As I drove back to the hotel, I reflected on the day's events. The revelation had been necessary, the confrontation inevitable, but the reconciliation, that was a choice all of us would have to make every day going forward. The foundation had been laid for something real between us. Now came the work of building on it, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, honest moment by honest moment. For the first time in decades, I felt genuinely hopeful about our future as a family. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my modest Millbrook home, watching through the window as Alexander and Benjamin helped their mother plant tomatoes in the garden that had once seemed too humble for her sophisticated lifestyle. The boys were covered in dirt, laughing as Benjamin accidentally sprayed his brother with the garden hose, while Aaliyah, dressed in old jeans and one of my gardening shirts, directed their efforts with patience that would have been unimaginable. During her Oakwood Hills perfectionist phase, the transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult conversations, moments of backsliding, and the inevitable challenges that come when people try to unlearn decades of harmful patterns. But what we had built together over these months felt solid in a way that our previous relationship never had. True to her word, Aaliyah had brought the boys to Millbrook that first weekend after our revelation. Watching 12-year-old Alexander stock shelves at Henderson's General Store, while 10-year-old Benjamin charmed customers at the checkout counter, had been like glimpsing an alternate universe where my grandsons knew their grandmother as a real person rather than an occasional obligation. "Grandma Stella," Alexander had said during that first visit, "why didn't Mom ever tell us you owned land? That's so cool." The question had given Aaliyah and me another opportunity to practice the radical honesty we were building our new relationship on. "Your mom was confused about what made people important," I had explained. "She thought having money was something to be ashamed of if you didn't have very much, and something to brag about if you had a lot. But really, what makes people important is how they treat each other and whether they're kind and honest. So you were always important," Benjamin had concluded with the straightforward logic of childhood, even when Mom forgot. The boys had adapted to our new dynamic with the resilience that children possess when adults finally start making sense. They split their time between both worlds now, the structured luxury of Oakwood Hills and the relaxed authenticity of Millbrook, seeming to understand instinctively that they could enjoy both without having to choose between them. Jacob had surprised everyone, including himself, by embracing the changes more completely than anyone had expected. He still worked in real estate development, but he had turned down the promotion that would have required even more networking events and social performances. Instead, he focused on projects that interested him personally, including a collaboration with Morrison Development to create more affordable housing options in smaller communities. I realized, he told me during one of our monthly dinners, that I had been chasing success instead of building it. There's a difference between achieving something because you love the work and achieving something because you love the status. The legal situation had resolved itself in a way that satisfied everyone's needs while honoring everyone's dignity. I had restructured the lease agreements for all the Oakwood Hills properties, giving residents actual ownership of their lots, while retaining ownership of the common areas and maintaining oversight of community standards. It was the arrangement that provided security for the families, while ensuring that the values of respect and inclusivity would be maintained. Morrison Development had initially resisted the changes, but when they realized that I was offering them a partnership rather than demanding their exit, they had become enthusiastic collaborators. Calvin Morrison himself had become something of an ally, often consulting with me on new projects and referring to me publicly as one of the most astute real estate investors I've had the privilege to work with. But the most meaningful change had been in my daily relationship with my family. Aaliyah called me several times a week now, not because she felt obligated, but because she genuinely wanted to share her thoughts and hear mine. The boys spent one weekend a month with me in Millbrook, and I stayed with them in Oakwood Hills regularly, always in the guest room, never again in the garage. "Mom," Aaliyah said, coming into the kitchen with dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction in her eyes, "the boys want to know if they can invite some friends from school to visit Millbrook next month. They want to show off their grandmother's empire," she added with a laugh. I smiled, thinking about how different that invitation sounded from the way I had once been hidden from her social circle. "Tell them absolutely, but they have to help me expand the garden if we're going to feed that many extra mouths." As evening approached and we prepared for dinner, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The garage had been a humiliation that forced a reckoning, but it had also been the catalyst for building something genuine between us. The land ownership had given me the leverage to demand respect, but it was the love underneath the conflict that had made real reconciliation possible. Money had opened doors, but honesty had built the relationships that walked through them. Most importantly, my grandsons were growing up understanding that worth came from character, not bank accounts, and that family bonds were strengthened through authenticity rather than pretense. As we sat down to dinner that evening, around my small kitchen table that somehow felt more elegant than any formal dining room, I looked at the faces of the people I loved most in the world and realized that this was what success actually looked like, not a mansion built on hidden foundations, but a family built on truth, respect, and the understanding that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, sold, or taken away. Sometimes the person you think you can step on turns out to own the very ground you're standing on. But more importantly, sometimes that same person loves you enough to help you build something better once you finally understand what really matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.